Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on March 26th with Jacqueline Kanyuk on Research in Canada, an Introduction. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Maureen Brady on Scottish family history research, historical and geographical background. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Maureen. Maureen Brady, a former school librarian and computer educator, has 40 years' experience with family history research. She has traced her Scottish roots back to the end of the 17th century and beyond, and has also pursued Chicago and the Midwest, the Trans-Allegheny U.S., Quebec, Irish, and Swedish research. Maureen has made numerous presentations to genealogical societies, libraries, conferences, and workshops throughout the U.S., as well as presenting for the Brigham Young University Library Family History Webinar Series. She is a member of the Genealogical Speakers Guild, as well as a life member of the Aberdeen and Northeast Scotland Family History Society and the Ohio, Chicago, and McHenry County, Illinois Genealogical Societies. She is also active in the Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, and Lake County, Illinois Genealogical Societies, the British Interest Group of Wisconsin and Illinois, and the Chicago Scotch Genealogical Group. And we'll now turn the time over to Maureen to share her screen.
Thank you, Olivia. So, welcome everyone. Here in the Midwest, I'm outside of Chicago. We're in the middle of some rather severe thunderstorms, so I hope the power stays on. If you are in the mood, you might want to say a quick prayer. So we're going to talk tonight about not how to do the research in Scottish family history, but how some of the geographical and historical events and landforms, etc., that you should be aware of as you're working on your research and planning your research goals. So first of all, let's take a look at geographical context. And this is a basic outline map of Scotland. I took this from Wikipedia. And you can see that it has a lot of shoreline. This is the North Sea wrapping around here. This is the Irish Sea here, and this is the Atlantic Ocean with the Gulf Stream up here. And then this is also an arm of the Atlantic. You can see how much indented the West Coast is. The East Coast is not near as much, but it does have some nice harbors over on this side. And then the English-Scottish border, it runs just about here. So this is the basic. Up here, we've got the Orkneys, and even further to the north are the Shetland Islands, all of which constitute Scotland, have constituted Scotland since the Middle Ages. So let's take a look at the next, and this is where you really have to start being aware of your geographical context when you're doing your research. First of all, most of us, I think, are going to be researching before 1890, and this would be the key map that you would need to be looking at. It is on Genuki, and all of my references and URLs are all in your handout, so you do not need to worry about copying them down. Genuki stands for Genealogy of the United Kingdom and Ireland, and they have a lot of excellent maps. I'll show you some examples later. But these are the county boundaries of Scotland before 1890. And in Scotland, almost everything is organized in a county fashion, with the few exceptions, which would be the major courts and the major religious bodies, but even some of them organize on a county level. And before 1890, you can see that there were some, for instance, this yellow one here, number 5, which is Nairn, also had a little pocket down here in Ross and Cromarty for whatever reason. And number 6, which is Inverness, Elgin Murray, they also had a section down in number 4, which bordered on to 7, and so on. These go back to medieval times, to medieval jurisdictions. You can see up here number 3A how scattered that one is. And so these jurisdictions, even though they seem quite odd, made sense in medieval days and continued to be used until 1890 when they reorganized the county boundaries. And so 4 disappeared from 5 and became part of this, the yellow. This was straightened out and so forth. You still need to know, unless you really are working in the 20th century and the last decade of the 19th, this is the one map you are going to be most focused on. You can see that some of these are quite large. This is mostly farming territory. This is Aberdeenshire. Some of them are quite small because there's some agricultural land along the coast, but then it very quickly gets up into the mountainous area. The cairngorms are very prominent here. And so there's very, very few people that live up in this area. So as you get further south, they become smaller because that's where most of the people live. And as we go north, we have larger ones and even ones that extend across the water. This is in Genuki. It is all outlined on Genuki very easily, and you can quickly figure out which one you need. This is the city of Aberdeen is right about here. The city of Dundee is here. This is Edinburgh, and this is Glasgow, which are the 4 major cities. If we take a look at one county, and I'm choosing Aberdeenshire because it's the one I'm most familiar with. My family almost totally comes from Aberdeenshire or its bordering counties. But we'll take a look at Aberdeenshire. And this comes from Wikipedia, actually, which actually then comes from one of the societies. But you can see the boundaries. These are all the parishes within the county. And while the county is the large area that you have to focus on to identify, you really need to identify the particular parish that your family lived in for even a brief period of time, because that's where the records are going to be identified with. They will not necessarily be stored there. They probably are in Edinburgh or the major city, in this case, Aberdeen, but they will still be organized by this parish division. And you can see that this little parish also is Tarvis over there, and Glenbucket kind of reaches, and Cabrick actually has a portion here on the Aberdeen side, but it actually also has a portion on the Banffshire side. So sometimes it's called Aberdeenshire and sometimes it's called Banffshire. And as you get up here, we have some bigger ones because there is less people and more land that has to cover. Essentially, a parish was organized so that the majority of the people were within walking distance of the parish church. Walking could be a rather long walk, however, but where the majority of the people could walk to church, that's where the church was, and that was where the parish was organized around. Now, there were some exceptions, mainly due to riverbanks, mountains, or high hills that came in the way and that sort of thing. And as you get into the physical geography, you can figure some of that out. Here, for instance, Crathie and Braemar, which you might be recognizable as the church that the royal family attends when they're at Balmoral, this is all mountainous. So while people can walk to church, it is going to be a difficult task for them to get there. It's going to be mostly along the riverbank. So this is the county of Aberdeenshire. These are the individual parishes. That's what you need to focus on, is figuring out what parish your family lived in. And then let's talk about what is a parish, since that's the important geographical division that most of the records in Scotland are organized around. First of all, before 1974, it was a geographic area within a county of Scotland. Post 1974, it was a geographic area within a council area of Scotland. Everything was rearranged in 1974, and the counties were done away with, and they became councils. And then in the 1990s, they went back to a county system. So the latter part of the 20th century gets very confusing. So let's focus on pre-1974, and a parish is a geographic area within a county. The name of the parish usually is not synonymous with the town or city that it is part of. Very few parish names reflect the name of the town or city. Most of them are the name of a church that was established during medieval times, and in some cases, the city or town came out and surrounded them. So as one example, the city of Aberdeen, there is no Aberdeen parish. There are the parishes of St. Makar, St. Nicholas, and then the newer parishes of Woodside and so on. But there is no town, there is no parish with the name of Aberdeen. There are actually 4 parishes within the city. In rural areas, a parish is going to be roughly 5 by 3 miles. It will be larger out in the more mountainous areas, but think 5 by 3. And usually no concentration of buildings larger than a hamlet, meaning the parish might not even have much of a town associated with the church. It would have the church and the churchyard and maybe 1 or 2 other buildings, but it's possible that there really is no town where the parish church is. After the Reformation, the Church of Scotland, which is 1560s, the Church of Scotland parish acted as both a religious and secular institution all the way up to 1855. So from the 1560s to 1855, the Church of Scotland parish was both the church, the religious body, and the secular institution that took care of the roads and the bridges and perhaps held sheriff court and other sort of secular activities. It was one and the same, all of it organized around the Church of Scotland parish. Again, those dates are 1560s at the Reformation to 1855 at the establishment of civil registration. And finally, the parish boundaries were also frequently used for the later census and civil registration district boundaries. And very, very often, the census district, the civil registration district, and the parish all have the same name. So you have to be careful as you get into the latter part of the 19th century and later, that if you're looking at the name, it's someone who says, I lived in Makar, then you need to know, does that, the parish they're referring to, are they referring to a census district that's within a parish and so on? It may get a little confusing, but it does make it a little easier because you always know they're going to be one and same in the same area. So we're going to take a look at 2 maps here so you can get an idea. The maps are what you need. Once you've determined a part of Scotland where the family is from or where you think they're from, Geographical has some excellent maps, and I'll show you in a minute. But in the meantime, you're going to just need to look for some maps on your own. And these are going to be, I'm going to show you 2 of the same area. This is 1 to 50,000. It shows you quite a bit of detail. Here is the main road from Aberdeen to Inverness snaking through. There's another secondary road here. You can see the trails. You can see where all the little, what are called farm towns in Scotland. These are small little clumps of buildings, mostly agricultural, where the agricultural workers live, where the barns were, that sort of thing. And you can see some of them are just mere trails that come out to them. This is 1 to 50. Now, take a good look at that for a moment. And I want you to focus on this area of Mains of Bog Feckle. Here's a section of Bog Feckle here, an outlying area. This is where the main house is, the manor house, if you will. Focus on this area, and we're going to go to the 1 to 25. Now we have the Mains of Bog Feckle and Bog Feckle, but now we have the Hill of Feckle, the Mill of Feckle, and so on. And each of these lines represent stone walls dividing off the fields for the sheep or the farm. You also can see trails in here and so on. This is the 1 to 25. And if you can find a map at the 1 to 25,000 scale, that's the one you really need, because then you get a sense of, well, if you have somebody living in Hill of Feckle, then that family is probably not the same family as the one living up here at Howe of Blair. They're not that far apart, but the families stayed around the same estate for the most part. Not 100%, but for the most part. So once you identify where the family lives, that is going to help you differentiate between the three Taylor families in the parish. And that's why this particular level of scale comes into a large use with you. Mine really are quite dog-eared because of that. So in your handout, I gave you the name of 3 places where you can find these maps. One of them is Genuki, one of them is the National Library of Scotland, and the other one is the Ordnance Survey, and I'll get to that in a minute also. So let's talk about place names. The Scots refer usually, and more so, to the place they actually lived within that parish, such as Bogfeckle. So you may find actual documents or letters or references in a family Bible or something of that sort, where it might say they lived at Fitty or Drum or Green Dykes or Old Moss. So now, what do I do with that? Well, guess what? Google comes into play here. You can look up any of these in Google and it will tell you where it is within Scotland. But you can also look it up on those map sites because they all are keyed with indexes for all of these little town and little clumps of building names. Fitty is a fishing village in Aberdeen. Drum is an estate along the River Dee. Green Dykes is up toward the Murray coast, and Old Moss is in 5-8. You sometimes will also find reference to a name that is not in the gazetteers, not on the online lists, but Google again comes to the rescue. So I found one in an old letter, and it was a reference to Fogielone. Well, I went to Google, and it took me to Wikipedia, to the article for Abercurter, and it says known locally as Fogielone or Fogie. It is a village in Aberdeenshire. So there's the usual local vernacular name for it, but the actual town is called Abercurter. But guess what? Abercurter is not the name of the parish. The parish, the church within Abercurter, is called Marnock, and that again goes back to medieval times. So you start with a local vernacular name, you find out that's part of Abercurter, but that still isn't the parish. Well, how do you figure out where that is? Well, that's where Genuki comes to play. Now, Genuki, if you've never used it, there is this section over here for first-time users, and I would recommend you work yourself through that if you've never used Genuki. But for this instance, we're going to look at Scotland, and we get a map of all the counties here, the pre-1790 counties, roughly. And you can see on the right and left all of these subjects that there are articles in Genuki about Scottish records. And because this is Scotland up here, these are all generic to Scotland. But I'm going to pick Aberdeenshire. We're going to stick with Aberdeenshire. And now we can actually look at similar articles for Aberdeenshire, all of the ones that do not have a little triangle. If they are just military history, you can get an article there. This one means there isn't one. And then I want to look for that Abercurter, and I can go to this Aberdeenshire Towns and Parishes link, and then go to the A section, and I find out that Abercurter has a section, and it tells me that the parish is Marnock. Now, I'm going to pick a different one. I'm going to the parish of Udny, also in Aberdeenshire, a little north and west of the town. And you can see that, again, we have some articles relating to the cemeteries of Udny, the churches and church records of Udny, and so on. Excuse me a minute. Excuse me on that. You get a full description from the Gazetteer of the parish of Udny. You can see this comes from the 1851 Gazetteer. It gives you a little physical description. It gives you some population. It says there is no village. Remember, I said very often that was the case. Pitmedden is not a village. It is an estate with a main manor house, and that's why it's marked. Tells you the boundaries and so on. So you can get to this basic map of your parish, the main names within it, in this case is Pitmedden and Milldale. And then you can also look at articles about the church records, and so on. This is why Genuki is a good starting point when you're just getting into an area and you just said, let's say you just found out your family is from Banffshire and they actually may have lived in St. Fergus. Well, you can go here to Genuki, look up Banffshire St. Fergus and get a good background on the things you need to know to do good at research within St. Fergus. You can also go to the full gazetteer here on Genuki, and there is a place section, and this is where you could put in Fogielone or Pitmedden or one of those things. So I'm going to put in Green Dykes. Remember, that was one of the towns I mentioned earlier, or one of the names I mentioned earlier. And it shows me on a map where Green Dykes is up here. And then if I click on that, you can see there are actually 3 Green Dykes, all of them here. And then the 4th one is down here actually in England, in Northumberland. But I want the one up here in Banffshire. So I would click on this, and then it would take me to the background information about Green Dykes and tell me that it's in the parish of Ortewell and so on. So you've got good background information on Genuki of a geographical sense to really get you going and understanding the area you're living, that you're researching in. Now, the National Library of Scotland has a new site up with a huge collection of maps from various eras and various areas. There's city maps on here. There's old city street maps and so on. The best one to use for this purpose, for what we're talking about tonight, are these 2 map finders, either with the marker pen or with the outlines. And you can see the grid up here. When you find something on this selection, it will tell you the name of the map coordinates if you want to purchase a map at either the 1 to 25,000 or the 1 to 50,000 scale. So this is a good one if you're looking to purchase a map for your own collection. This would be the one with the marker pin. They both are excellent. And you can also do some of these others. This side by side actually takes a view of the old map and then a current satellite view, and you can do a side-by-side comparison if you wish to. Excellent map, National Library of Scotland. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource, and it is totally free. It is sponsored by the Scottish government. And then the other one, which I mentioned in your handout, is the Ordnance Survey. And actually, this will tie to the Ordnance Survey right here, this choice. So that's the geographical context in a very quick manner in about 25 minutes. If you have questions, please put them into the chat, and hopefully we'll get to them at the end. Now let's talk about the historical context. Let's first look at the settlement patterns. If someone says that they're Scottish, what does that really mean? Well, that means that their heritage comes from what today we call Scotland. But as we go back in time, and as the DNA patterns are proving out, it is actually a conglomeration of several different ethnic groups, several different cultural patterns, which settled what is today Scotland. So here's that outline map I showed you earlier. And over here in the Northeast, we'll take a look at the oldest known group that's been identifiable, and that was the Picts. And the reason we know about the Picts is because the Romans interacted with them, actually fought them. And so the Picts are mentioned in the Roman records, and they called them pictured people. And so that's where the name comes from. The Picts had no written language, so there is no written language to try to find, but they left a lot of stone markers and stone incised inscriptions, if you will, on hillsides and such, most of which, if not all of it, is still not decipherable. We do not know what those pictographs mean, but they are all over the northeast of Scotland, and you'll find them in churchyards. You'll find them in the backs of farms, yards, and so on. The Picts were there for centuries. We don't even know how far back in time the Picts were in that part of Scotland. Then the next group we usually talk about are the Britons, which were Germanic people that came across, this is the North Sea, or sometimes called the German Sea, because Germany, Holland, and the Low Countries are right about down in here somewhere. And so they would come across the North Sea to the east coast of the Isle of Britain, and they started to settle this east coast, not only in Scotland, but also down in England. And that's why they were called Britons, because they were coming to the island of Britain across the North Sea. They are Germanic in historic context, and they originally spoke a very Germanic language, which is why there are so many German words or variants of German words in the English language. And then also coming from the south, but out of the main part of what today is England are what we call in Scotland the Angles, the English. These are the Anglo-Saxons. These are the ancient folk of Great Britain, of England and Wales in particular, that were found by the British, written up about the British and so on. And so the Angles moved north and settled the southernmost portion, the southeast particularly, of what is today Scotland. So far we have ancient Picts that go back in time to we don't know where. The Britons coming across the North Sea from the Germanic companies and settling the East companies, Germanic countries, excuse me, settling the east coast of the Isle of Britain. And they are settling down here in the southwest of today's Scotland. The Angles, the Anglo-Saxons coming up from England and settling mostly in the southeast. Now, over here on the west coast, from here over to about here, this is where Ireland is. And this is only 20 miles. So in history and over the centuries, there was constant movement between the west coast of this island, the Isle of Britain, and the Isle of Ireland. And the Irish came across and settled in this area. The Scots later on could easily cross and go into Ireland, but that's another story. That's a story of the Ulster Scots. But the ones who came across and settled these western coast areas, very deep, they're called sea locks. They're so long, a lot of coastline here, many, many, many islands. This is just showing the major ones. This is Skye, this is Lewis, and so on. They settled this area with their Gaelic language. Now, the Picts had no spoken language that we know of. They probably did, but we don't know of it. The Britons had a Germanic language. The Angles coming out of the Anglo-Saxon area, they had an early form of English down here. So very early English, a Germanic language, a language we're not sure what it was, but only left some pictures behind. And now we have the Gaelic-speaking people of Ireland coming up and settling here and creating the kingdom of Dalriada. So this became Gaelic, and this became mostly English-German. And then up here in the very north, we don't know who settled this area. It could have been the Picts. It could have been another group of people who have been lost to time. And it could have been the Vikings who settled Shetland and your Orkney Islands here. Again, it's not very far between here on the water. So this could have been Norse and Viking, though by language, it appears to be more Gaelic, but we aren't sure. So that's why there are question marks there. So the Norse and Vikings are Shetland and Orkneys. We're not sure about this area. And then we have Gaelic, not a known speaking language here, and then Germanic English down here. Those are the DNA roots, which have been proven, of what is today the Scottish people. Now let's take a look at religious patterns, because religion is a major force in Scotland up through and at least the 1920s. It was very conservative, very religious community that, for instance, everything closed down on Sunday. You only went to church on Sunday. You read the Bible all day when you were at home, and so on. So religious patterns have been very, very important in Scotland. And the Reformation, until about 1560, Scotland was Roman Catholic like the rest of the world. And it was not just because the Irish came over, everybody was Roman Catholic. But then we have John Knox, who was a prominent church person from Edinburgh area, who heard the preachings of John Calvin in Switzerland. And he was impressed by them and saw that they were more oriented, in his opinion, to the Bible and to the teachings of the Bible. So he brought that back to Scotland, and we then had the Scottish Reformation, different from the English Reformation. The English Reformation was primarily because of Henry VIII establishing the Church of England. But in Scotland, it was more along the lines of John Calvin's teachings, and it was creating the Church of Scotland, what today we call the Presbyterian Church. So, and there's a big but, because the Scots are highly individual and independent people. They form their own opinions about everything. If you know a Scotsman today, you know that to be the truth. They are not shy about offering their opinions, and they will tell all and everyone what they think. And one of the things they are very strong about is, don't tell me how to do my life. So while we have the Presbyterian Church, and most Scots, at least on the East Coast and South, became Presbyterians because it was an independent church from the bishops and all of that. We have a strong influence at the level of who is the monarch at the time. Now, before 1603, we had separate monarchs. There was a king or queen in London, and there was a king in Scotland. But in 1603, when Elizabeth died, and they wanted a Protestant and Catholic, they got into the Protestant and Catholic, which one should it be? The heir was James VI of Scotland. He became the heir to the English throne and became James I of England. And at that point in time, we have two kingdoms with one king. They are still two separate countries. But once the English king got to London, or rather James VI, the Scottish king, got to London, he liked it down there a lot more than the area in the north. So he stayed in Scotland and really became James I. He is the James of the King James Bible. He is the one who asked for that and arranged for it to be retranslated into a more common language and so on. But as the different people became the head of the government, things happened with the Scottish Presbyterian Church. It is still the church that is considered to be the church of the country. But the first one came up in 1638, not even 100 years after the Reformation, with the National Covenant. In England, the king down in England, even though he was also a Scottish king, he became convinced that the English forms, the English church organization, were the way to go for the Scots. And he tried to force that organization onto the Scottish people. Well, most of the Scots disagreed with him, and especially the landed gentry and some of the earls and dukes and so on. And those earls and dukes came together. You can see from this photo the very well-dressed men here, but you also have some not so well-dressed in the background. But they came together and signed what is called the National Covenant in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Glasgow. They put their seals on it at the chance of death because of those seals, but they sealed the covenant that they would abide by the Presbyterian forms and not the government coming in and telling them what to do. It became known as the National Covenant because the language of it, the men are covenanting between themselves to support each other in this cause. It became almost a period of civil war. not between the people, but between the British forces, the army, trying to put down this movement, and in some cases got quite warlike. One of them, then we have Charles II. We had Cromwell in there, but we have Charles II coming to the throne in 1662. And he is very much a proponent of this English form. So the Covenanters are now forced to do secret meetings. And this is a picture that was a painting that was done by Alexander Carse of the Covenanters meeting in the Glen on a Sunday, holding their church services. And it's called the Killing Times because if they were caught, they were usually put to death. And there are many, many stories about this, of people being imprisoned in churchyards and so on. There was some transportation to the colonies, but for the most part, if you were caught practicing the Presbyterian religion as you saw fit, then you would be put to death. And this is the preacher here. You can always tell the preachers by the black robes and the white collars. This is Charles II in 1662, the Killing Times. Then we have the Glorious Revolution of 1688 after Cromwell. And now the church can reestablish itself in Scotland, doing it its own way. So we have the Church of Scotland is the state church, the official church. It's expected that everybody goes there, but that isn't true at all. We have the Episcopal Church, or Anglican Church, as it is called in the British Isles, and that is mainly in the Highlands and seen as sort of not Catholic, but also not Church of Scotland. And if you really like the Catholic forms and so on, and you like the idea of a bishop, you're going to go to the Episcopal Church. And then in the Highlands and Islands, amongst the Gaelic speakers particularly, there is still strong Roman Catholicism even to this day. And then you have all the nonconformist churches, which are coming out of England or from missionaries coming over from the colonies in the 18th century and so on. So if you belonged to the Church of England, you were considered a nonconformist. That meant not conforming to the ways and laws of the Presbyterian state church. You have to read it that way. They do not conform to the ways and laws of the Presbyterian church. So any of these churches are considered nonconformist, and you will see in the church records, especially the marriages, you'll often see a comment that it was a nonconformist ceremony, or they were married in a nonconformist church. And all that simply means is anything other than Presbyterian. So let's take a look at some historical milestones, some dates. And in your handout, I gave you a much longer list, but we're going to look at these particularly because these are the ones that really affect what records can be available and what's in those records. So 1560 approximately, we have the Reformation and the establishment of the Church of Scotland, which was officially the church of all of the people, certainly not by a long shot, but that was the official one. 1690s is the first time you're really going to find lists of people. There are church records earlier than the 1690s, going back to the Reformation, but it's mainly in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And if you aren't in those two major cities, it is highly unlikely you're going to find a church record or any real record with names before 1690. In 1690, they started to tax your hearth, or a poll tax, which was a head of household tax that paid to the government. And there's also a tax list in there for some parts of the country taxing how many windows you had. But hearths were in everybody's home. And so that's the main one of the 1690s period. And it was by head of household only, but at least you'd get a feeling of who's living in the parish at that time and how many people of any given surname. 1746 to 1782 is the Act of Proscription, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. 1783, the Treaty of Paris gives independence to the United States of America, and the British government loses the monies of the Stamp Act, which was one of the reasons for the revolution. So they turned around and forced that Stamp Act on their own people in the British Isles. And it was in effect from 1783 to 1794. Now, in Scotland, the main effect of that is that there was a tax that you had to pay for any entry in a church register. So if you were getting married and you had to go into the church register, you paid a tax. If you were having a child baptized and you wanted it in the church register, you had to pay a tax. If you were burying somebody and you wanted it in the church register, you had to pay a tax. Well, the practical effect of the Stamp Act in Scotland is that you're going to find marriages because that proves legitimacy of the children, but you're going to find a lot of missing baptisms and hardly any burial information at all in that 11-year period. Then we have, starting in that same period, the Highland Clearances, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. 1841 is the first census in the British Isles. It includes England and Wales with names. It did not give relationships, but it did tell you everyone living in the household. 1843 is the disruption, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, 1855, civil registration begins, and that's the government registration of all births, marriages, and deaths. And the church registers do go on, but they no longer are the official record-keeping bodies of Scotland. It now becomes civil registration. So let's talk about the Act of Proscription, 1 August 1746. The Protestant Catholic conflict continued for quite a long while in mostly Scotland, but there was some of it in England. And the Scots, a lot of them supported the Stuart kings as the true kings of Scotland. James was a Stuart. And so they were supporting eventually Bonnie Prince Charlie. There were actually two periods of revolution, one around 1715 and one in 1745. The 1745 one resulted in the Battle of Culloden, which is the last battle ever fought on British soil. The Scots lost in precipitous manner. Many, many clans were decimated. And then on August 1st, 1746, after that battle, Parliament passed this Act of Proscription and required that it be read on a Sunday, a given Sunday, by every minister in Scotland from the pulpit. And I've actually seen it transcribed in the church register as the effect of this. And basically what it said, you can read this, but that from the first day of August, no man or boy within that part of Britain called Scotland shall wear any clothes commonly called Highland clothes, including the kilt, the trews, the shoulder belts, etc. No tartan or partly colored plaid of stuff on coats, and then you are liable for imprisonment and so on, and can even be transported for the space of 7 years. The top part of this, where it talks about that you couldn't have or bear a sword or target or any of that, was also part of the Act of Proscription, and so was the speaking of Gaelic. So from 1746, until it was repealed in 1782, it was illegal and punishable by imprisonment or transportation to practice openly any part of Scottish culture from the Highlands. Anything to do with Gaelic or with the bagpipe or with the wearing of plaids or tartans, anything along those lines was illegal, and you could be imprisoned or transported for that cause. It was finally appealed in 1782. But of course, being Scots, they're not going to listen to the government very much. And so this always was, they maintained all of this in the background, behind the scenes. They spoke Gaelic in their homes if they knew it was safe. They hid their plaids and so forth in who knows where, under rocks or whatever. They never let this die. So after 1782, when it finally became legal to practice Highland culture again, it all started to come out from hiding. Gaelic again was being spoken widely. And so this was part of Scottish culture that still extends to today because the people of the time would not let it die. In 1785 to 1820 is what is known as the Clearances. That is primarily in the northwest of Scotland, in Caithness, Sutherland, and Ross and Cromarty, though not exclusive to those three counties. After Culloden, the other effect of that battle and the loss was that the Highland chiefs forfeited their lands to the English king. And the English king then awarded his supporters with this land up in the northwest of Scotland and gave them the ownership of those lands. Well, it became a matter of absentee landlords. They didn't want to live in that far north climate. And they hired managers to go up and manage those farms. Well, they determined that the best money maker for that area of Scotland were sheep. And sheep like to be able to roam wide open fields, which means you don't want people growing crops. And so they systematically, beginning in 1785, started to clear the population out of those areas of Scotland, usually by force of some sort, and drove them out of those three counties. Some of them went to other parts of Scotland. Some of them became fisher folk down in the fishing towns, and some got on the first ship they could find or were put on and went to the colonies, primarily Canada and the United States at that point. This is a painting of one of the left in ruins farmhouses of that era. And the two best books to get the information about the clearances is Albion Seed and The Line in the North, both of which are in your handout. They both give excellent explanations of this period of time called the clearances, and The Lion in the North really can tug at your heartstrings if you have any Scottish blood in you. Then we have finally the disruption on 18 May 1843, when the Free Kirk of Scotland was established. And you can see here's another drawing, and it's the parishioners walking out of the parish church of Marnock, which actually still exists and looks exactly like that. And because they did not like the way they were forced to appoint a minister. In the English church, the ministers were appointed by the bishops, by a hierarchy, and the members of the congregation really had little say in it. In the Presbyterian church, each individual congregation chose their own minister. Usually a minister would come and give a preach and a sermon and meet with the members of the congregation, and if they liked him, then he would be called to that congregation to become their minister. The government tried to force the English forms, again, once more, onto the Scottish church, but this time 60% of the congregations, especially to the north and east, walked out of their church and formed the Free Kirk of Scotland, meaning free of government interference. And for that 60%, you suddenly have all of these people dropping out of the Church of Scotland registers. You can't find them in any church register because they're in the Free Kirk registers. So you need to keep that in mind. It's for a 12-year period from 1843 until the establishment of the civil registration in 1855. And those free church registers are starting to appear on the Scotland's People website, which is also referenced in your handout. 60% in the north and east walked out and formed this church. That is more than half the country. And unless you're down in the mining regions of the south, the lowlands, or Edinburgh or Glasgow, if you're researching in there, there will not be as much of an effect. But if you're anywhere north of the Highland Line, this will be an important thing to keep in mind for the 1840s and 1850s. Now, if we take a look at social context in the last few minutes that we have, the language is English to a point. The official language is English. The ministers typically wrote in English, and certainly they wrote in English as we know it in the civil registration. But you are going to find examples of vernacular writing, especially if you have family letters or Bibles or things of that sort, and even sometimes the ministers. So to give you an example of what that could look like, this is from Robert Burns's address to a haggis, quite famous amongst the Scots. And this is English, but it's closer to medieval English than today's English, but this is written in English. It's called the Scots English, Scots. Then we also have the Doric. Now, there are 4 accepted forms of language today in Scotland. English, that is the King's English. Gaelic, that's Scots tongue, like Robert Burns's poem to the Haggis. And in the Northeast, Doric. Doric is its own language with some recognition of it being English, but you're going to find Middle English terms very much put through this, and its own pronunciation. It is actually being taught in the schools now in the Northeast and is accepted for children to respond to their teachers in Doric, because most of the households of the Northeast speak Doric if they were raised up in the Northeast. This is what it looks like in Doric, and this is what it looks like in English. And I won't take the time to read it, but you can see what kind of language you are up against. And imagine for a moment that you are a recorder in 1860 and you don't understand Doric as a rule, and someone comes in and they're speaking Doric to you when they want to register their child's birth. How accurate is that record going to be, maybe? There are 2 excellent glossaries. They are in your handout, the Scottish Historians Glossary and the Scottish Archives Network. They are both available online, and they have all of these old Scots terms as well as Doric terms. So if you run across something and you go, what in the world is it? They're good places to go to get the definition. Names and naming patterns. This is a common Scottish name with the MC prefix meaning son of that they have in common with the Irish. But people in Scotland, well, you want to save your ink and you want to save your pen nib and so on. So you're going to use other forms. If it sounds right, it is right. So we have Macintosh and Macintosh, but you notice as we go down the line, they use an apostrophe for a good part of it, the CIN. And then I actually have one branch of my Macintosh family that dropped everything but the Tosh, and around 1870, and they have been Toshes ever since. So you have to be aware that you find a Tosh family, and they might be in the records as Tosh, but they might be in the records as an earlier form of that name where they just shortened it. So keep in mind that. And then we have pronunciation. My great aunt was a Carney. That's how we pronounced her name. She was a Carney girl. But in fact, her name was spelled like it was Cardno. It comes from the Doric and from the Picts, we think, where the silent D makes no sound, and so it's Carno, which can easily then become Carney. And it's spelled with the D, but it is not pronounced with it. Be aware of those kinds. There's a lot of silent letters when they are pronounced, not when they're spelled, but when they are pronounced. D's especially, and GH's especially. This is in your handout, the naming patterns where it's paternal grandfather, maternal grandfather, and so on. This is not just Scotland. Much of Europe used this same pattern. It is certainly not 100%, but it is a good guide to think about when you're trying to determine that previous generation. Now take a look quickly at occupations, especially because of the Scots and Doric languages. There's a lot of unfamiliar terms used for occupations that you will see in the church records as well as in the civil registrations after 1855. all three of these come from after the 1855 period. A dry stain diker, a putted heed maker, and a traveler. A dry stain diker built stone walls without mortar. Stain being stone, dike being wall. Potted heed maker is the Scots version of making head cheese. And then a traveler is not a traveling salesman, but someone who travels in caravans, lives out in the fields. Sometimes we would call that type of person a gypsy. Oops. One of the ones that I had a terrible time with trying to find out what square right was, I mean, other than it had the word right, which implied builder of some sort. Well, again, Google came to the rescue, that it is a particular Scottish term for a very skilled carpenter or woodworker who used square joints, square cuts in his joinery, and usually that was in furniture or sometimes in carriage making. But this took me a long time until I finally thought, well, let's see what Google says, and there it is. Finally, I want to talk about the statistical accounts of Scotland in the few minutes we have. And this is, again, in your handout, and this is another good way to get a feel for where your family came from. There are no names here, but this is the geographical, historical, and cultural background that you need to really understand the time frames, what's going on, why they may drop out of the records or not, where they may have moved to, and so on. It has its own website. It is part of the Scottish government, so it is free. When you go on the website, it looks like this, at least it did a week ago. And if you go down, scroll down, you get these options. And the ones you want are these two. This is from the 1790s, the original statistical account. They call it the old one. And then the new one from the 1830s and 40s. And this is parish by parish. They asked each Church of Scotland minister to answer a series of questions about his parish. The minister was free to answer it in short answers or in long answers. It was up to him, and he could answer it in any way he wanted to. But it gives you a huge idea of what life was like on a daily basis to your ancestors. And a quick couple of examples. This is Ordewill in the 1790s up toward the Murray Coast in Banffshire. And this is from 1790, 517 souls, 130 below 10 years of age, and several old people have died lately, all upwards of 90. You can see the oldest person just now is 86, number of males and so on, about equal. There are 6 seceders, which was a form of the Presbyterian Church, not the Free Kirk, and about as many Methodists, 2 Roman Catholics, and 1 Episcopalian. Where that Episcopalian and Roman Catholics, where they went to church, it doesn't say. Also from 1790s, a lot of these miscellaneous observations. And this one is what I'm talking about when it tells you what it was like on a daily basis. About 30 years ago, there were only 3 hats and 3 watches in the parish, being those the proprietor, that means the landowner, the minister, and the schoolmaster. But now, that would have been the 1760s. But now, in the 1790s, almost every laboring servant has his hat and watch, his English cloth coat, his white thread stockings, etc. So in a 30-year period of time, we went from an economic situation where only 3 men had a hat and a watch to almost every man in the parish having not only the hat and watch, but the fine clothes to wear on Sunday. This is Fyvie in the 1790s, a really good physical description of the town and of the mosses, which we would call marshes, and so on. And then as we pop up to the 1840s, we get miscellaneous where it talks about the progress of the area. You can see many bars to husbandry have been removed, new roads, and so on. This gives you the background you need to understand the daily lives of your relatives. And that's why I include that. So enjoy your journey. And I'm going to take it back. I'm going to stop share so we can do questions. We've got a few minutes. like two.
Okay, thank you so much, Maureen. Um, we don't have any questions yet. We just have a comment from Catherine Schultz. She says, my second great-grandfather was called Square Bob, and he built fine furniture with dovetail joints and stagecoaches. Cool.
So he was a square right.
Beth in the Q&A says, what is the difference between MC and MAC?
Nothing. There is no difference. MAC is the full spelling of the word. It is the Gaelic word meaning son of, which in Scandinavian countries became the SCN or SON ending on a word. In the Gaelic countries, it was the beginning of the word and it was Mac. And it came sometimes then people dropped the A and it just became MC, same meaning. And then as we get into the latter part of the 19th century, it even became the practice to make it M apostrophe and drop the AC completely. And in today, even in Ireland and in Scotland, many families have even dropped it completely. So if you had McAuliffe, for instance, today the name could be just Olive. But they are both representative of the Gaelic word meaning son of. Is
Um,
there a term that means daughter of? No. I should have mentioned this and I didn't, and I apologize. Women in Scotland have equal standing with men and retain their maiden name from birth to death. The only time their maiden name is not used is when it is a census, and usually it's an English census taker who doesn't know that he's supposed to do it. But in church records, on the birth records, on the marriage records, even in the death records, a woman is always associated and identified with her maiden name. It is one of the things that makes Scottish research much easier than the rest of the world, because you will always know who she was. And they are considered equals, government in law, in church, in any way, shape, and form. And so it wasn't important if you were a daughter, it was that Mac really meant child of, that was treated as a child of, though officially it meant son of. He was born in Aberdeen, but can't figure out in 1929 on, okay, 1929 is online at the scotlandspeople.gov.uk website. I put it in the handout. It is the government-run site for all church records and civil registration records. 1929 is still not publicly available. They have a 100-year law for it to go online, but you can order it and you find the reference on the scotlandspeople.gov.uk website, and there'll be a little link to order the certificate so you can actually get the certificate. He came in 1920. Okay, 1912 is available online at the Scotland's People. They have a really easy index. You would just look up his name, 1912, and you know it's Aberdeen, so I'll give you the registration districts for Aberdeen are going to be Aberdeen, St. Makar, St. Nicholas, Woodside, and the name of the starts with an R and it's the name of a quarry, and now I can't come up with it off the top of my head. Woodside, St. Nicholas, St. Makar, and Ruthiston, Ruthrieston. Those are the registration districts for Aberdeen. And they all start, the registration district number all starts with 168. She's lucky she had the right city, and I knew that.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. We have one more in the Q&A from Jackie. It says, so if a man is called Wilson, aka son of Will, would that mean his father was in the lowlands?
No, that would not mean his son was that he was in the lowlands. Wilson actually can be, this is not 100%, can be a reference that the original ancestor in Scotland came from Wales. It's a very broad interpretation, but that is one of the major forms of that word is they were from Wales. A Walesman, Wilson, you have to kind of play with the name. Scots do use that S-O-N as even up in the Highlands. My family's Robertson in English, Doherty in Gaelic, and the son simply meant just what it means in the Scandinavian countries, son of. And then you go before that. So he's a Will, son of a Will, son of a Welsh, and I think you can kind of see where that goes.
Okay, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on March 26th with Jacqueline Kanyuk on Research in Canada, an introduction. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.